Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Double Down, the live news and affairs programme that puts people first. We're broadcasting live from Dundalk and Dublin. I am your host, Finbar Markey. Welcome to the show, folks. It's Ireland's Independence Day. You wouldn't think it, would you? There's no celebrations happening around here. In other countries, there's fanfare and there's carnival and there's television programmes and everything else. But here in Ireland, nothing seems to be happening. So tonight on our show, we're going to cover two topics that are quite related to the concept of Ireland and independence. We're going to be talking to one-time Cork City Councillor Diarmuid O'Cadhla in relation to his campaign with his colleagues to decolonise Ireland. In other words, to take away the British symbols of colonialisation that still exist, such as street names. We're also going to talk to Sinead Murphy and Chris Murphy, who are interested in the idea and advocate for the idea of deregistration from the electoral system and a return to our 1922 constitution. Before we're joined by our guests tonight, I'd like to look at just some of the news events that have happened over the last week or so. You may recall in November, there was big scandal about Leo Varadkar a couple of years ago leaking a draft proposal document from a big doctors' union to a smaller doctors' union. And there was a bit of scandal brought out, mainly driven by Village magazine's reporting of the matter. Well, since then, it's all gone quiet. But Double Down at the time, and our take on this, was that the story was not just as simple as Leo Varadkar leaking something to a friend of his. We believe that the story was more complex. Lots more questions had to be asked because there seemed to be a lot of political engineering and shenanigans going on behind the scenes. Big questions like, where did Leo Varadkar get the report in the first place? And the new question that Village magazine has just brought out this week. Why is it that Leo Varadkar's cabinet partner and party partner, Simon Harris, at the time that Leo Varadkar was actually leaking this document, Harris was saying as Minister for Health that he couldn't get access to the document, and he was telling this to the Dáil. So who is telling the truth? The scandal grows and grows. And Village magazine have put out a tweet today asking the big question, when are RTE going to pick up this story? This story is expanding and nothing is going to stop it. So we're calling on RTE, the national broadcaster, paid for by the people of Ireland. Will you please pick up on this story and start talking about the real things that are happening in this country? Okay, in the EU Parliament, and we never hear from the EU Parliament, which is another problem with our RTE media and media in general in Ireland, that the main decisions that have been made that influence our lives are happening in Europe and we hear nothing. We had Claire Daly on the show before Christmas, and she was at it again, working away for the people of Ireland last week in the European Parliament. And this time it was in relation to the Republic of Catalonia and the leadership of the Republic of Catalonia. Catalonia is a self-declared republic declared a couple of years ago through a referendum and a plebiscite that was held in that state at the time. They decided that they wanted to be an independent republic. Since then, their leaders have been driven into exile across Europe. They're hiding in Belgium and Germany, amongst other countries. Claire Daly last week in the European Parliament gave a very rousing speech condemning the government of Spain for making extra legal attempts to extradite the leaders of the Catalan government back to Spain to jail them. So we have a clip of Claire Daly really showing us what Claire is doing in the EU, despite the fact that RTE are not showing you. Have you got that there, please?
So why in God's name are we trying to undermine that good work by the politicisation of this report by elements in this Parliament opposed to Catalan independence? Is there no end to this, really? Unhappy with the fact that Catalan politicians were not extradited from Belgium or from Germany because the crimes that they were supposedly responsible for are actually not crimes at all under the double criminality clause in those countries. And instead of seeing that now and making sure that doesn't happen again, we see in this report the call for offences against public order and constitutional integrity to be exempt from double criminality. We cannot accept that. Have ye not learned from history? You cannot suppress a movement by repressive measures. And fundamental rights apply to everybody, even Catalans, and you should remember that.
Claire Daly representing the people of Ireland in terms of what's happening throughout Europe and the persecution of the democratically elected Catalan government. So we're going to keep following that story, and we're actually in talks at the moment with the Catalan Assembly in relation to having a representative come on the show to give us further information about what's happening there and how the campaign to establish a proper republic is going on. Here in Ireland, we're being given lots of figures about COVID, and COVID is just everywhere in the news. And it is a serious problem. I've got family members who've been hospitalised because of this virus. I live in Blackrock in County Louth, which is the epicentre of the virus at the moment, or one of the epicentres, if you want to put it that way. So what I'm about to say is not in any way taking away from the idea that COVID exists and it's a real problem. But I would like to address the issue of truthfulness and trust in terms of how our government and how our scientists and doctors are relating and interacting and communicating with us, the public, not just in Ireland, but around the world, and especially in the United States too. I'd like to focus in on the idea of people misrepresenting the facts in what they might feel is the public interest, and how in the medium to long term, this actually goes against what they originally had intended. We have, just to give you an example, I suppose, to start this section off. In the United States in spring and early summer, Dr. Fauci made pronouncements all over American media that masks were of no use in terms of stopping the spread of COVID-19. He in fact said that masks could be dangerous. In summertime, he went in a complete U-turn and said that everybody should wear masks. And he was questioned about this. And I'm going to run Jimmy Dore, the one-time comedian and activist, actually covered this conflict of information. And could you run this wee story? And it just shows Fauci's answer to the question, why did you tell people in spring not to wear masks? They are dangerous. And in summer, tell them to wear masks. Could you run that first, Stephen, please?
To your first question, which was, what about a month or so, or 2 or 3 ago, when people were saying, you don't really need to wear a mask? Well, the reason for that is that we were concerned, the public health community, and many people were saying this, were concerned that it was at a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in very short supply. And we wanted to make sure that the people, namely the healthcare workers, who were brave enough to put themselves in harm's way to take care of people who were infected with the coronavirus and the danger of them getting infected, we did not want them to be without the equipment that they needed. So there was not enthusiasm about going out and everybody buying a mask or getting a mask. We were afraid that that would deter away from the people who really needed it.
And so what Dr. Fauci is really saying there is he told a lie. In spring, he told a lie. He did it in what he thought was the best interests of the public and the providers of services in this time of COVID. But ultimately, he told a lie. People could have made their own masks. In fact, I do recall that as soon as we were advised to wear a mask, people started to make their own masks and started to make masks for residents of older people's homes and started to make masks and give them out to the community, functional masks. So that lie in spring and early summer denied people the right to make their own masks, but it did something worse. It breached the faith and the trust that we have in people like Dr. Fauci. Because what information can we believe when he admits himself that he lied in spring and in early summer 2020? In Ireland, we've been provided figures on a daily basis about infection rates, about hospitalizations, about death rates. And there's a sensationalism in the way these figures are being presented at times. And that sensationalism is presented in the lack of detail. So, for instance, we're told X amount of people are in hospital today, or were admitted to a hospital today with COVID-19. When we look at this, is what a newspaper might report. When we look at a breakdown of the figures, we find half of the people that are in hospital caught the infection in hospital itself, or over half have been catching the infection in hospital itself. But we, the public, have been led to believe that these are all people who are catching the infection in the community and are then moving into being brought into hospital with symptoms. And that is not the case, and it's a more sensationalism that when it comes out in a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months' time, that in fact these are the more detailed figures, people will again lose faith in the information that they are being provided. And this is a real worry. In Ireland, we had Leo Varadkar talk about how people are registered as dying from COVID. And when we listen to the details of it, it's very clear that a lot of people are being registered as deaths from COVID when we just don't know. People who've been end of life, who had symptoms which could have been flu or could have been pneumonia or other things, but because COVID was the big sensation at the moment, they've been put down that they died from COVID. Stephen, could you roll that clip from Leo Varadkar speaking to members of An Dáil?
Countries count differently. One thing we always did in Ireland was to count cases in care homes from day one. Other countries didn't do that. We counted suspected cases even when there wasn't a laboratory test confirming that the patient had COVID. Other countries didn't do that. And we didn't discount people who had underlying conditions like other countries did. So if somebody had stage 4 cancer, was in a nursing home, and was suspected of having COVID but didn't test positive for it, we counted that.
The true burden of excess death.
When we hear things like that, and then we look at our newspaper reports on a daily basis, or media reports, it casts a shadow of doubt over so many other things. And yet there is a pandemic and people are falling ill, and some people are falling seriously ill. But this kind of thing, in my mind, adds fuel or gives fuel to the conspiracy theorists who are creating some outrageous conspiracies that, for instance, the vaccine itself is some kind of a miniature robot that will send data back to central hubs somewhere. And outrageous. But when we can't trust our leaders in science and government in terms of the information and the detail of even if they are telling us misrepresentations, thinking it's in the public interest, we will find out, and it will cast a shadow of doubt over everything that you say into the future. That's all I want to say in that matter, folks. We're going to move on to our first guest. I want to introduce, and I've been really looking forward to talking to Diarmuid for over a year now, since I first saw his campaign. It's Independence Day, as I said earlier. Independence Day isn't being celebrated in Ireland, and other than the blowing up of Nelson's column, I can't think of any action that decolonised Ireland or took away the signs of British rule here, signs that many people feel are signs of admiration for people who were in fact tyrants. Diarmuid was until the last election a city councillor for Cork City. He, with others, engaged in a campaign of what might be called redacting, if to use an administrative term, redacting the names of streets that are named after British colonial tyrants. Diarmuid, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Finbar. Great to join you this evening. And it's good to see this alternative media growing. So thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, and by the way, just before, thank you, Diarmuid. Any viewers out there, will you go on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube now, or Facebook, whatever, and just say, share the show and say you're watching it. Let's start building this alternative media, because we're not going to do it just by having a show and not promoting. If you like what you're hearing, if you're liking the discussion, if you think there's more freedom of expression here, share the fact on Facebook that you're watching this program now and ask people to tune in. And let's build this medium. Diarmuid, sorry for interrupting you there.
No, what you're saying there is vital. I mean, you mentioned our good national broadcaster RTE in your news roundup, but you forgot the announcement of their big salaries. I mean, look at the vulgar salaries some of their presenters are taking. And it is beyond belief, and they don't even present honestly the news that's happening. It's a very narrow concept of what's news, and even that is spun. So RTE have now even taken to advertising that they're telling the truth because they know they're not being believed anymore. So I very much encourage the building of alternative media, and it must be free independent media. It can't depend upon Facebook. As you know, those social media outlets are entirely controlled as well.
Yeah, if you could see what was in my pocket and what was in the production team's pocket, you'd know that we were certainly not bored off by anybody. Diarmuid, I get stick as usual. We don't throw questions on people. We let them know what questions are coming a few days beforehand. Before we get stuck in, you were a councillor on Cork City Council.
The County Council, yeah.
The County Council. What was that experience of being an independent, working amongst all these big parties?
I tell you, it was an eye-opener. As an activist, a bit like yourself, Finbar, I've been an activist for as long as I can remember. I've also been very involved in business affairs, actually. But anyway, it was an eye-opener going into Cork County Council because I've always had a view of these systems of representation, but never being on the inside. And when you're on the inside, you certainly do see things. I mean, I have a few honours to my name as a councillor, amongst them being physically ejected from a meeting for asking a question. A question over a simple thing like the budget. I asked, are these matters not decided by the political party, in the parties in their separate meetings in the council, and why bother coming to the open forum to debate them? And for that, I was called names and ejected. They voted to eject me from the meeting, imagine. Anyway, I've had lots of adventures there where questions get ruled out of order. Legality is broken on a frequent basis. Like, these councils are dominated by the undemocratic party system and woe betide anybody who asks the wrong question or who wishes to challenge them in any way. And, I'm a good, I think, a well-mannered person, so I never provoked anything as such, other than simply ask the question and insist upon answers. So it was educational and a valuable experience. And it does present possibilities to people.
Do you think that in your time there, do you feel that you achieved anything?
At this stage, no. I mean, I know I did help quite a few people in my efforts there. However, those are kind of occasional passing things. In terms of changing policy or anything like that, or how the council in general acts, I have to say no, I didn't. And the reason I didn't is because the system is controlled very tightly by an elite in the same way as our state is controlled by an elite. Like, county councils are subservient to the Oireachtas, much as you pointed out earlier when you mentioned the European Union. The Oireachtas is actually subservient to the European Union and is treated as if it itself was a local authority. So our systems of representation are really taken from the people, I think. That's clear.
You got into the headlines, Diarmuid, with a campaign to, well, I'm phrasing it as to decolonize Ireland.
That's well phrased. Yeah.
In terms of what you were actually doing, you were redacting, or you were blackening out street names that were named after, for instance, Queen Victoria or Lord Marlborough or all of those kind of guys. How did that campaign come about?
I tell you, Finbar, I'm involved in quite a few things, and not on my own. There's a whole movement of people here in Cork. I am far from being the only activist involved. But for years we have run memorial ceremonies on Gortamore or the genocide, whatever phrase people like to address it by. And would you believe an outstanding thing in Cork City, as big as it is that over 100,000 people in the greater Cork City area died in the 1840s during that genocidal attack on the people of Ireland. Yet there's not one single memorial in the city to remember those people, not one. But we have 10 city streets named which are honouring Queen Victoria, known as the Famine Queen. So that highlights something which is widespread. We actually wrote a report at the time. We identified over 100 streets in Cork that are named after imperial generals or landlords or some despot or other who committed the most terrible crimes against our own ancestors, and we still have them up on our streets named. So at the time we compiled a report with a lovely name on it. It was called A Comprehensive Proposal on the Naming of Streets in Cork. And we invited the Lord Mayor of the city at the time to receive this and a delegation that we could explain the proposal. And they point blank refused to meet us. And this was back in late 2016, coming into January 2017. And next thing we see in the media, that the city has now invested a lot of money in assigning a new area of the city and calling it the Victorian Quarter, again named after the famine queen. And they do these things, they say, for marketing purposes and all that, to promote tourism and business and what have you. But the Victorian Quarter, as it is now named, centres around a street named after the Lord Mayor Tomás McCurtain, who was murdered by the British government, the same government of Victoria and so on. It's an outrage that we have a city council who, decade after decade after decade, have shown themselves to have more respect for royalty or anything foreign as opposed to anything native. They have no respect for the Irish people. And we're all concerned with our economic future in this country and the well-being of the people. And our conclusion was at the time, so long as the people do not respect themselves or have governmental systems which don't respect them, then we simply have no hope. So we said a starting point is that we should respect ourselves and our own ancestors, and in doing so, uphold the values which respect them, and not the values of those who actually oppressed the Irish people and who were responsible for the deaths of many millions of Irish people, not just 1 million, many millions of people who lost their lives through starvation and disease during that period of the 1840s and 50s. And so we took a stand against that, and having been ignored, we said, we'll force the issue. And we went out in broad daylight, we advertised it, and we even made a video, and we painted out the name of Victoria. We just picked on her name, she being the most outstanding example. And we blackened, you can see in the image there, we blackened the name of Victoria, and in memory of the nameless, like there's one site in Cork where there's 30,000 people buried in a mass grave. 30,000, and we don't know their names or anything about them. And the city has done nothing to respect their memory. Yet they were happy to spend over 150,000 trying to prosecute myself and 2 others for having painted out those names, and which they failed to do in the end.
How did that come about? So I can imagine that the planning started off with, listen, we'll get a load of Semtex and we'll put it on all the walls with the name. And it ended up that just blackened it. What was the planning that went into that, and how did that come about?
Well, there were a series that one of the images you showed there, myself and the 2 lads with these posters, we organised a series of public meetings in the city, which were widely posted. Some of those posters are from those meetings. And we asked the people of Cork, would they discuss what values are important in our city? And we weren't simply saying, let's name all the streets after Republicans and revolutionaries. There are other people in our society and culture and history who have value and whose lives we should uphold as examples in the field of science, sports, medicine, all kinds of areas. And that, should we not respect ourselves in this manner? Like that sign you showed, Victoria Road, which was painted out, that's on a street. In fact, I may have mentioned the example to you. And that's on a street beside Ashton School in Cork, around the corner from where a young Cork lady in the early part of the last century grew up, a woman called Mary Elms, who ended up as a young adult going to Spain, helping the refugees from the Franco oppression during the Civil War, helping children and hospitals and so on. And when Franco became victorious, went with the Spanish people across the mountains into the south of France as refugees, helping them in the camps there. And then to have World War II break out, she carried on right through the Nazi period and helping people and families escape Nazism. So she is a woman who has been unnamed in history until we raised her name actually a number of years ago. But wouldn't it be a nice example to the neighbours in the street she lived on, to have it named Mary Elms Road rather than naming it after a person who propagated genocide and Holocaust, to have it named from someone who opposed it. So there's many contradictions in Cork City, and they seem determined not to look at them. They'll do anything. The offence we committed to them was we didn't kowtow, and we forced the issue. We knew, this is specifically against the law. However, we said that we were charged with criminal damage, but as far as we're concerned, it wasn't criminal damage. It was a legitimate, conscientious protest, against something which is an obscenity in our community, that we should honour someone who had committed genocide here, not just here, but across the world, in India, repeatedly, and in China, and conducted the 2 opium wars against the Chinese people, the consequence of still which is going on today. This woman was the biggest drug monger ever in the history of the world, and she is honoured and respected in Cork City by officialdom, and woe betide anybody who says otherwise. So we were quite happy to go out, not hiding, quite in the open, and challenge them. And they brought us to court. And interesting, actually.
Were you actually arrested? Were you
arrested? Actually,
taken into a.
We were arrested. I was held for nearly 4 hours in a horrible old, kind of what you might say is a Victorian-style cell. If you saw it, it exists from the same era. It was really an effort to knock us on the wrist and say, you know, don't do this. We're teaching you a lesson now. Unnecessary completely, because we were admitting our actions. There was no denial involved. Even in the court, we didn't deny painting the signs. We just denied that it was a crime. We said it was legitimate because there's a greater offence against our community taking place. And we had been refused all official means of raising our objection. So we had nothing left, only our conscientious objection. So protests are legitimate. We have that entitlement. And sometimes they cost the state a little bit of money. So that's the price of democracy.
What was the outcome of that case?
It only concluded there in December, having taken nearly 4 years. And the outcome was, the judge found, he said, that we had actually broken the law, but he was reluctant to convict us and give us a criminal conviction. So he agreed, and in fact, on my suggestion, he agreed that it was sufficient if we made a contribution to charity. So we did that, and we have no convictions now at all. So, so they failed. The state spent, I'm told, over 150,000 euros in their efforts because the prosecution had gone via the High Court. One of the spin-offs of this, which also is on the issue of our culture and identity, one of the spin-offs was, forever, when I deal with the official state, I always use Irish. I'm an Irish speaker. Even my tax affairs, everything, I speak Irish to them all the time. So when this came to court 4 years ago, I insisted that the judge should speak Irish and understand me in Irish. And there was big arguments at the time. So anyway, we went to the High Court and got an order from the High Court back to the District Court in Cork telling the court, provide a judge who speaks and understands Irish, which they did. And that judge actually was quoted in the media even of acknowledging that we were honourable people in what our doings were, and left it at that, and was quite happy to have us donate to charity, which to our mind is a victory because we have not been convicted of a criminal act. And had we been, in fact, we would quite happily have gone to jail. There's no way we'd have paid a fine or paid any compensation to City Hall or anybody else. And had they done so, we'd have been out the next morning doing it again. In fact, we couldn't even do it again because it's been done again anyway. So people seem to be taking up this idea of civil disobedience and crossing out these offensive, vile names which are offensive to the whole character and notion of an independent people.
Tell me, what was the community response to the campaign?
It was mixed, I have to say. I know on the morning we did it, the following morning after we did it, one of the local radio stations did a kind of a phone-in poll, and it came out roughly 50-50. People who agreed with our action and others who said no. But I'm thinking that a lot who said no more disagreed with our painting as opposed to our point of principle that we shouldn't be honouring the likes of Victoria. So there's widespread support for what we did. And there is also a significant number of people, though, who disagreed and who accused us, for example, of trying to wipe out history and so on, which is far from the truth. We're in favour of teaching history and learning it, and it's our loss that we don't understand the history of our own state.
Yeah, okay. Did you get contacted by anybody outside of Cork in relation to being inspired by your campaign, or?
And I tell you, at different times when it was in the media, there's not a single issue in my whole life I have received more messaging on. I received literally thousands of messages acknowledging and supporting what we did. Thousands of them. I do know others, whether inspired by us or not, up in different parts of the country and abroad, have carried out similar activities. So we're encouraged in that people want to take up the point that we're not a servile people anymore. We're a people who have self-respect, have our own values, our own culture, and we shouldn't turn our back or apologise for it to anybody.
Yeah. Is there a bit of background noise there, Diarmuid?
I heard something, but it seems to be gone, is it?
That's okay.
There's no noise in this room I'm in anyway.
Just another question, because we're just running short on time. Apart from street names, is there any other aspects of Irish society that could do with being decolonised, or to have the symbols of British colonialism removed?
There is, and you'll be familiar with the organisation Conradh na Gaeilge.
Yes, we had a representative on there before Christmas.
Yeah, Conradh na Gaeilge was founded a year after Douglas O'Cadhla, the first president of this state, Douglas Hyde, gave a lecture entitled The Necessity for the Decolonisation of Ireland. And that was an inspiring lecture he gave, if anybody ever wants to pick it up and read it. It's only a short 4 or 5 pages. But he reckoned that Irish people are stuck in a kind of a no man's land, on the question, particularly so on the question of our language. He took the example and said, if you take 10 Irish people and say to them, we'll guarantee your material well-being for the next 100 years, say, you'll never be short of anything. You'll have jobs, healthcare, comfort. But what you must do in return is you must give up your Irishness. You must change all the place names to Anglo names. You must forget about the Irish language, the poetry, the history. Will you do that? And we'll look after you materially forever, basically, for generations. And Douglas Hyde reckoned 9 out of 10 Irishmen would be outraged at the suggestion. And I agree with him. He took the opposite example and said, if you went to our neighbours across the water and did the same thing, he thinks the result might be the opposite. And I think he's correct, because we are neither asserting our Irishness nor rejecting it. If we accept it, we should accept our language, which is the biggest badge of our Irishness. So tomorrow in the Oireachtas, they're discussing the Irish language, the new Language Act, which they're talking about. And if you listen to it, it's a joke. I heard some preliminaries on it. But for example, last week in Cork County Council, there was a vote here in Cork. The council have a progressive policy. They're introducing what's called age-friendly parking. So if you're a senior citizen, there are special spots allocated for your use and signs up to indicate that. In the Gaeltacht areas, naturally enough, these signs will be Oscaoiling. But the council had decided that because it was too complicated to make Irish language signage or Irish English language signage, that the signs outside of the Gaeltacht areas in West Cork would be in English only. Now that's a direct breach of the Official Languages Act. Yet the council, in its wisdom, voted that that was okay to do that. So that's the other big issue in Ireland today. The treatment of the Irish language. I believe it is evident that the state is trying to kill the Irish language, except none of them are man enough or woman enough to come up and say so openly, because they know the first party in Ireland to stand up and say, let's forget the Irish language, they will be history overnight, gone, because the Irish people know and have respect for their own selves and our language. So this is the major cultural issue of today, and it is going, and I'm optimistic though. It will revive. There's huge interest in it, growing every year actually. It will revive, but it will revive at the same time as we sort out our society in general and not have people dying on the streets, not have people with no future, not have senior citizens living in fear that they might get sick, not have media and government officials lying to us, as you outlined yourself. So we have a very funny society, and it's lacking in cultural values that support the Irish people. I say that in favour of Ireland, not against any other people, but we should look after what is of value in Ireland, primarily the people. That is what we should be doing, and take on those values. That is where culture arises from historically, is how it sums up our cultural value, if you like, and how we interact with our environment and our identity of ourselves and who we are, and how our relations happen with our environment and with others as well. So there is.
I think one strong sign of our culture up until the English introduced an education system in Ireland in the 1830s was the Celtic notion, or the Brehon notion, of greater equity amongst men and women. And I think that's something that the British colonialists did not necessarily beat out of the Irish, because in my household growing up and in my working class area growing up, women ran the household, and it was a matriarchal society that we lived in. So I would agree with you that there's so many things that we could look at: language, how we interact with each other, and simple things like place names, which can have a big impact on how we perceive ourselves in history. One final question for you. It's kind of two questions in one, Diarmuid. We're running over time there. Is do you have any plans for the campaign? And B, part B of the question, if viewers wanted to find out more about this kind of stuff, where would you direct them?
There's a Facebook page, facebook.com Cork Street Names. But if someone looks up me, if they search my name, they'll find it and lots more. But I mean, the main battle for the last couple of years was the court cases, and we do intend to pursue this, including where we're campaigning like mad to have a memorial erected in Cork City in memory of our own ancestors who were the victims and who were dispossessed during this period of the genocide in the 1840s. And so we're continuing that work, not exclusive to fighting the battles of the economy today and of the politics today. I think you're going to talk in a while now about our electoral systems, which are utterly corrupt. And so, yeah, we welcome people to stay in touch with us, visit the Facebook page, and I'm hoping others should take up the same kind of campaigning and the same insistence on respect for ourselves, as has been done, not just by us, but by others before us. For instance, do you know, Victoria's statue used to be in the grounds of Leinster House. I think maybe around 1848, it was removed.
And now it's in Leo Varadkar's bedroom.
Yes. Well, in fact, Albert is still in the grounds of an Taoiseach's office in Dublin. And of course, outside the Dáil, you have Nassau Street, named after the man who was the chief economist of Queen Victoria, a man who in 1846, I think, said that if 1 million died in Ireland, it was not sufficient to suit their purpose. And his name is honoured on one of the main streets in Ireland, in Dublin, Nassau Street. It's an absolute shocking indictment of the mindset that exists. I mean, you pointed out today is our Independence Day, declared in the first Dáil Éireann. So we should celebrate that. But unfortunately, that republic was never realised. An issue will come to down the road with the establishment of the Free State in what I would say, and many would say, was a counter-revolution. That the ideals of that republic and the ideals of the independent state proclaimed on this date were never realised, and therefore we're left with this colonial legacy where our language is destroyed, where our place names are still sullied with such terrible hangovers from our imperial masters. You won't find in the streets of Paris streets named after Nazi leaders or anything like it. But Ireland does this. While all over the world they're tearing down the statues of tyranny, in Ireland we preserve them. In fact, we persecute those who object.
I think you put the case over very well, Diarmuid. I don't think the case could be put over any better. You're going to stay online because you may want to come in at the end of the next topic. So stay there, Diarmuid, but stick on your mute button if you don't mind.
I will. Thank you.
And we'll be joining you at the end of the show. Okay, so I'm joined by our next two guests. And first of all, thanks again for Diarmuid for coming along. I've got a feeling Nassau Street may not be called Nassau Street by the end of the week. That has nothing to do with the show, may I add. We're joined now by Sinead Murphy and Chris Murphy to discuss. There seems to be feedback there, guys. Is somebody listening to the show whilst this? Anybody? That's a bit better now, is it? Okay. Sinead and Chris, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah, we're here.
Okay. Just before we go on, does anybody else have feedback?
Yeah.
I think it's cleared up now. Okay, brilliant. Stephen in the background has sorted out whatever that is. Sinead and Chris Murphy are not related, live in different counties, and they are advocates, we'll say, of a process of deregistering from the electoral register and reverting back to the 1922 Constitution. I've spoken to the guys over the week to try to extrapolate on this a little bit more, learn some things about this myself. Guys, first of all, I'd like to thank you for coming on the show tonight. We still have some feedback there, have we? Am I the only one hearing feedback?
Would it help if I turn my mic off? And
let's just check it out. Do you want to hit your mic for a second there? And I'll continue talking and see if we have this feedback. There's still a little bit of feedback there. Sinead, does anybody have a phone beside their laptop or anything like that?
No, mine's off. Been back. My two phones are off.
Okay, we'll try that again. I'm still. Are you guys hearing feedback?
No.
No, you are, Chris. Okay. Right. Well, listen. I'll just persist anyway, and if Stephen can in some way communicate in the production team to let me know where that's coming from. Okay. Let's get stuck into this discussion. How did you two guys? I'll start with Sinead. How did you get into even thinking about the idea of deregistering from the electoral register and then reverting back to an older constitution? How did you even get around to thinking about things like that?
Well, for me, Finbar, it happened. I think it was about 3 elections ago. If you remember, we had a stalemate, and I think the country ran itself probably for about 6, 7, 8 months. And I kind of thought to myself, okay, hang on a second, like, who's driving here? So after a few nail-biting months, Enda Kenny got back in, and to be honest, that was the straw for me. I said, right, that's it. I'm never, ever voting in this country again. So I actually seen a comment from Chris on Facebook under his wife's profile about deregistration, and that kind of set me on the route. But I will say something. Had I not have kind of went and educated myself on the reason why you need to deregister, that's the really crucial part. And I really hope your listeners don't just deregister without doing that, because if I didn't do that, you'd have some silver-tongued TD like Michael McNamara with lovely mane of hair would come along then, and he'd probably convince me to re-register. But the fact that I know how the state works, the fact that I know we don't have accountability from our leaders, the fact that I know we lost a Bill of Human Rights, I would rather die than sign up to that constitution again, because it is a slave document. So that is where I started on my journey. And I'm still on a journey. I still have loads to learn. But like, it is about self-education.
Okay. And Chris, how did you get involved in this? Can you unmute yourself there, Chris?
yeah, it's Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael that actually led me to the subject in the first place. And really, it was a no-brainer to make the decision once you compare the two contracts. You know, you compare the 22 with the 37. It's a no-brainer. Like, one is just much better than the other. You know, so I also I have first-hand experience of having no success in defending myself in the courts in this country, even using state documentation as evidence. They should have vindicated me in a particular case. So I realised there's nothing in it for me really in this state. You can't win. And
okay, so for both of you, it seemed to be you're just disappointed with the system, your own experiences of the system, and looking at what was happening at a national level. Would it be correct in that overall general assessment?
Yeah, that's where it started. But as you learn how the state works and how your vote gets you absolutely nothing in this country, nothing. And when you look at scandal after scandal, that there's no punishment for the people that are responsible, you have to think to yourself, there's something not right here. There's something enabling this corruption at every state level. They can't keep getting away with it. So the more you learn, when you see it, you can't unsee it. So that's, you've got to learn how the state works, how it operates, and what your vote is getting you really before you deregister.
So we'll talk about the deregistration process in a minute, but in terms of focusing in maybe on the 1922 Constitution and the attractive features of the 1922 Constitution compared to the 1937 Constitution that we're under now. Maybe, Chris, could you maybe throw out a few attractive features that we don't have at the moment?
Yeah. Well, it's your Bill of Absolute Rights is major, because your rights under the de facto, as I call it, the devil era contract, your rights are fundamental. Claire Daly mentioned that you have fundamental rights in the speech she did in the European Parliament just there. Fundamental rights are not absolute rights. They're legal rights, and they're revocable if deemed to be in the interest of the state. So technically you have no rights. So you get your Bill of Absolute Rights back, so you have your non-revocable rights back. You get your power of referendum, which, is kind of essential if you want to consider yourself to be a republic in any shape or form. And you also get the opportunity to recall rogue politicians for failing or just refusing to uphold their mandates. So those guys are sackable with no pension if they don't do their job. So that to me is quite attractive. Those three things are the majorly attractive things to me.
Okay, so the right to recall, referendum, and a Bill of Rights.
Absolute non-revocable rights. Your rights at the moment are fundamental, so they're revocable. Not much good.
Okay, so are you saying that under the 1922 Constitution, I can go out and smack somebody over the head with a hammer? And
absolutely not. No. That's ridiculous. That's breaking the law. The law is you do not hurt, harm, or injure another man. You've created subject matter damage there. You've definitely broken the law. But the fact of the matter is, if you're a politician or if you're a guard or anybody else that does that, the law applies to everybody equally.
Yeah. So under the 1922 Constitution, laws can be enacted that can revoke your rights under certain circumstances, where depending on your actions.
Well, the politicians, the parties, they present themselves to the people who have a position for them, and the position is where the politician works for the people for a wage, and they present their mandate, and if they don't uphold their mandate, well, they're sackable with no pension, and rightly so.
I just wanted to go back to this idea of irrevocable rights, because I think in all civilizations and under most forms of government, there are circumstances under legislation. So usually you'll see the phrase, even in constitutions, save where otherwise in law. And so, you'll see something and you say, oh, that's absolute.
That's right. Like basically, your inalienable rights, for example. You're inalienable, but you have the right to contract. You have the right to not contract.
You see, our rights come with a disclaimer in the 37.
We'll move over to Sinead there. Go on, Sinead.
I said our rights come with a disclaimer in the 37. There's that common good thread that runs through it. And it's just such a fluid thing. Who actually decides what the common good is? You have rights unless it interferes with the common good. But the people don't get to decide what the common good is. So who gets to decide what the common good is? That disclaimer wasn't in the 22. Shouldn't be in the 37. It's too subjective. It's too fluid. It changes. common good this week is different, might be different next week. So that should never have been allowed pass. And it's just down to the people who were poorly educated. When this was foisted on them, it was coerced on them by the church. And if you look at the results of it, it went through on 56% majority. But there was more spoiled votes than there was yes and no votes put together. So what the hell does that tell you? They hadn't a clue what they were voting for. They didn't know what they were giving up. And it's not fair that from that day till this, we're suffering as a result.
Okay. And tell me, what are the major selling features of the 1922 Constitution?
Well, I'd echo what Chris said. You need to have accountability. You cannot have a fair leadership without accountability. I have a job. I need to know that if I do something wrong in my job, there will be consequences. They don't have that. So of course they're not going to do the job to the best of their ability. I wouldn't do the job to the best of my ability. So we need accountability. We need enforceable rights. We need our natural resources back because we had them in public hands in the 22. There's no such thing as private Irish water. But De Valera set it up for our minerals to be privatised. We lost so much. He said he was just going to take out all the references to the Crown, but I think they took out something like 30 different articles. So it wasn't fair. It was coerced on the people. They were guilted into it, and we've been guilted into voting ever since. So
can I be a devil's advocate? Okay, and that's what I am being now.
Yeah.
Can you have too much democracy? And what I mean by that is, there was a movie made in the 1970s, and Peter Cook was one of the main characters, and the other character in it was wearing a bowler hat in it. He was Captain Manwaring in Dad's Army years ago, and Peter Cook. And it opened up this movie. So it was called The Rise and Rise of Michael Rimmer. And this movie opened up in this dusty old marketing company, Victorian-style marketing company in London. Everybody's wearing bowler hats, and the manager of the place is the Captain Mannering from can't remember his name, from Dad's Army. And in comes this young man wearing a 1970s nice cut suit. It was Peter Cook, and he went into every office and he said, "I am your new PR director," or whatever it was. And nobody questioned him, and he just came off the street. But within a few months, he had turned it into one of the biggest PR and polling companies in Britain, and made a big name for himself in polling. But then he turned it into a political party, and he had people out in the street protesting, "Direct democracy now. We want more democracy. Give us our democracy." And they got their way. This polling company that became a political party got elected. And on the first day after the elections, a little letter came in your door saying, "We want you to vote on some major issue, yes or no." And in the middle of their Coronation Street, there was an interruption because there had to be a discussion on that matter. The next day, there was 2 letters in the door. "We have to make a decision on X and Y today, and your TV is going to be interrupted a bit more." Within 3 weeks, there was portfolios of documents arriving at every citizen's door to decide on every matter, from our relationship with Mongolian pig farmers to our policy on nutrition in the gardens of the Phoenix Park, whatever the case might be. And eventually there were people out in the streets protesting, "No more democracy, no more democracy." Is there a danger of too much democracy where people get sick of it? I'll put that out to whoever wants to take that.
I don't mind. Chris, do you want to answer that one, or I don't mind?
Are you on mute there, Chris?
Yeah, you hear me now?
Yeah, go on ahead.
Yeah, Finbar, I just like to offer another film as an argument against your example, and the movie I'll use is a much more famous example than your own, and it's The Lord of the Rings. And if you remember that there was nobody that could not be corrupted by the absolute power that the ring would give. Even Gandalf, he was the guy, like, if he can't wear this ring, nobody can wear it. So what I'm saying to you is the same thing in this scenario. The people are giving their power to a handful of, well, rogues, really, aren't they? They seem to be anyway. You know, the caliber of people that come for the job, I mean, they don't seem to have any morals, if you ask me, and they definitely have no shame.
But
So,
my worry is that, for instance, when we were speaking to Claire Daly on Venezuela before Christmas, she was an independent election observer at the elections in Venezuela. She was saying that because there was so much democracy now in Venezuela since the Bolivarian Revolution, quite often you might only get 30% of people out voting because they've had to vote on things, 3 or 4 things this year.
okay, well, I'm going to bring you to an example closer to home for you. There's a country called Switzerland that has citizens-initiated referendum now. This system that we're talking about here, they've had it for over 800 years. They've got Protestants and Catholics living side by side. They've never had a war there in over 800 years that they've had the system. They had a referendum recently. Well, when I say recently, you know, I'm talking maybe a year or 2 ago, whatever it was. They had a referendum on whether they should raise taxes, and the people voted yes, they should raise taxes. Now, to me, that's the sign of a country that works.
Okay, good response. I can't argue with that. In terms of other dangers, just focusing on referendums for a minute, and I'd like to hark back to some old movies from the 1940s and 50s and 60s in relation to, let's say we were going to have a referendum on the matter of immigration, people immigrating into Ireland. And, you know, you see those movies where a young black person is accused of something and it turns out that they're innocent. In the long run, there was a court trial, but something terrible happened in the meantime. A whole city got into flames because it was inflamed by falsities about this story about this black person or whatever the case might be. Is there a danger that people can become emotive and yet be uninformed in the democratic process, and that if we were to have referendums, that we could have a referendum on very important and very impactful issues on people? And let's say you could, over a period of 6 months, develop from beginning to end a referendum based on some 1,000 people signing a register or something like that. Is there a danger that people could be vote emotively and impede on people's human rights in doing so?
Will I answer that, Finbar?
Yeah, Sinead, come on in with that, Sinead. Yeah.
I would say that's just the nature of democracy, really. People will vote emotionally anyway. So I don't see any difference. People vote with emotion. People, you know, there might be a scandal before an election and it's going to sway whatever way the media will run that story. It will sway people. But that's just democracy. You can't, like, do we want people-led democracy or do we want state-led democracy? We want people-led democracy. We want a voice. Our voice was taken from us. Our voice was our right to call our own referendums. We can't do that anymore. I'm willing to take a chance that if there might be a referendum once a week, I don't care. I just want to have the option that if we want to call a referendum, we don't have to wait for the state to tell us. And then when the state do tell us we can have a referendum, they tell us what we can vote on. And then if we don't vote in line with what the state wants us to vote for, they'll send us back again to vote. So I don't want that. I think we deserve better than that.
Okay. And just one final question on this issue of more direct democracy and referendums and things like that. When we live in a society that is so compelled in terms of how we make decisions by a media, and that media is driven by the finance houses and that's sponsored quite often by finance houses and big business and things like that. And that ultimately has thus far resulted in why and the media that goes along with it, that has resulted in why we continually elect people that do not do things in our best interest. And that we all as a country know are liars and deceivers and leakers, as in Leo the Leak's case. But if we don't change those other structures that lie around our democracy but are not a part of the actual electoral system itself, like media and the power of media and where the influence of media lies, if we don't change that, is there any point in trying to change anything, I wonder? We'll hit the two of you up with that. Chris, do you want to go first on that? Are you on mute again there, Chris?
I say poor Diarmuid got a crash course in how useful the 37 state is with dealing with the county councils. He mentioned the Language Act, isn't that correct?
No, let me pull you back to the question.
Oh, sorry,
Right.
sorry, I thought
Yeah.
it was relevant. Sorry, go on.
Yeah.
What
So
was your...
just the question is that when we have a media that is so insipid and that is owned by the financial system and by the political party to have this relationship together, some might say, what's the point in trying to change anything if you don't change all of that as well? We'll still keep on, no matter what democratic system we have, we'll still keep on making them decisions. Do you have anything to say to that point? Do you think we should try to change those other things as well as our electoral system?
Well, I think the people are actually trying to change, the problems that we're having with the media. The RTE, I mean, you saw the crude, crass joke that they played at Christmas time, you know.
The God's
joking
rape
about
joke.
rape is not funny. You know, you don't joke about rape. You don't joke about cancer. Like, look what, of course the media has to go. They haven't got a clue. And we know what they're like. We know that they're government propaganda mouthpiece. They're here now for a problem. So, yeah, they're going to be a problem with the other constitution as well, aren't they? Yeah.
And Chris, I think I know what you're about to talk about, and we're going to come to that in a wee second. Okay, so that's why I just didn't want it to steal the wind out of me sails. Sinead, can you come in on that last question?
Yeah, I would definitely. I mean, you're always going to have a corrupt media. They're corrupt globally. We all know this. You can see it's what they don't report on, and and that's why I'm so appreciative of you, highlighting this subject this evening, because nobody else will. We normally get blocked on certain pages when we bring it up. But if we had accountability for our leaders written into our constitution, the media can say whatever the bloody hell they want. But if we see corruption and we have the power to hold our leaders to account when they're caught out, doing their expenses, or saying they're in work when they're not, whatever the case may be, scandal after scandal. If we have accountability, the media can say whatever they want. The government will do a better job if they know they'll get into trouble if they make a balls of it, basically. Sorry for using profound language.
No, spherical objects are not offensive. Footballers would have a problem if they were. One final question to both of you guys, and it's really focused on the deregistration aspect. We're over time, but we will run for a few minutes more. It's focused on the deregistration aspect, which is the main thing. It's the means to your end, if you want to put it that way. I've listened to you tonight, and nearly everything you've said I agree with. We need more democracy. We need a right to recall. We need a right to call a referendum ourselves. We need all of those things. They're very, very advantageous and they're necessary. What is the point in deregistering to achieve this? What does deregistration achieve? If you don't mind, I'll just call in one of you to answer that. The reason being that there's a follow-up question and we have some timing issues. Does anybody want to fight over who'll go for that question? Maybe Chris. We'll go for both of you. Chris, come in quickly.
Chris,
what does deregistration achieve?
Why deregister? Well, you deregister because it's the lawful, peaceful solution to this legal dilemma that the nation has found itself in. I was born into it. I'm born into a nation of subservient slaves who are tied and gagged with, and the clue is in the name, it's the devil era contract. That's what it is. You're a slave by consent. It's a de facto contract. You're not a republic. So
are you saying deregistration will automatically bring us back to the 19th?
It brings it back by default because the 1937 contract was enacted by plebiscite. It was enacted by plebiscite because it's not a lawful contract. It's a legal slavery by consent contract, so it could only be enacted by plebiscite. Plebiscite is lawfully reversible, and the lawful solution to reversing plebiscite is deregister.
Okay. Sinead, do you want to add or take away anything to that?
Yeah, well, I would just like to add, the secrecy around the actual numbers on the register actually it screams how important it is. And Diarmuid's being an ex-councillor, you might be able to give us a bit of advice, because how do we find out what percentage is registered? You can't even get that information from the Freedom of Information Act. So it's so heavily guarded. That shows you its importance. So
My final question on deregistration, then I'm going to pull Diarmuid in just to see what he thinks about the subject, and then we'll close up.
Could I just make one point? Yeah, the county councils are legacy institutions. Banks are legacy institutions. The churches are legacy institutions. The insurance companies are legacy institutions. The 1937 state has no jurisdiction over any legacy institution. So all these acts that the people write, they're just for show. They're just for show. That's all it is. Like Diarmuid will attest, the state has no power over the county councils. If you cannot establish jurisdiction, you cannot have a court case. That's the law.
Well, we won't get drawn into that's a bit of a rabbit hole because we're time limited.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
One last question about deregistration, and it's this, and it's a very serious question, and it gets to the nub of the matter. If it's a case that people campaign for deregistration, and over, let's say, 5 or 10 years' time, 20% of the people, the people who want change most, deregistered, are you not, in fact, disenfranchising them from the political system as it exists? And even though all of the things that you speak about are very attractive, is that not achievable within the current system, rather than asking people to disenfranchise themselves of any political sway or power over maybe 10, 20, 30 years before you'd be successful enough to have enough people deregistered? Is there a danger there that we actually would be running into the hands of people who do not have our best interest at heart? And I will open that up to the three people in the room. I'll go with Sinead first.
Okay, well, to answer that question, you'd have to look at what you're actually getting for your vote in Ireland. So for starters, when you vote for the government. As soon as they get elected, they stop representing you. Okay, they have to actually then sign a contract to represent the state. So the people that actually hold all the power in this country aren't the ones that we elect. So that's what your vote gets you in Ireland. So it's an illusion of your vote actually doing anything. So you have to weigh it up. Do you want an illusion of a vote? Or do you want to remove your consent from a flawed document that gives you no rights, and then try and educate other people to do that? So at some point, we will revert by default back to a document that had more protections for us.
And in the meantime, is there a drip?
Well, it's happening. I tell you one thing, Finbar.
It is happening.
It is happening. It's happening because it's happening really, really slowly. You can see it on social media. More and more people are coming around to the idea. They're realising how the state works. And I will say one thing, and there's so many Facebook pages out there. If anyone is asking you to put money into a GoFundMe page to fight for your rights, that your rights don't come with a price tag. And there's loads of pages out there, and they're probably watching tonight, so you know who you are because you have blocked us. It's an individual choice whether you consent to that constitution or not. Nobody can go and win your rights for you. You have to get them yourself. So don't be, coerced into giving people money because they're fighting for your rights or they're uncovering the truth. Because they won't talk about the constitution. They block me and all my friends, and all we're talking about is the truth. We have nothing to gain from this, and we have everything to gain. I have never attempted to get on the gravy train. I don't want to go into
pull you back a little bit. I'll tell you why, Sinead, because there's the time limit, and I want to pull Diarmuid in. So you think it's a worthwhile, I suppose, chance to take that. For a lot of people, what you're saying is they're not going to be disenfranchised because they're disenfranchised anyway. Is essentially what you're saying. Chris, in a couple of sentences, could you come back in with that as well? Are we actually by encouraging people to deregister, are we disenfranchising them of any political power that may hold at the moment?
Ask the homeless people. Ask the majority of people that suffer and that have to endure the treason on top of treason. And what's it going to be next week? What's the scandal going to be next week? I just want to use Jesus as the supreme example as to why you're wasting your time waiting for any knight in shining armor that's going to come and save you.
If you can use Jesus in 2 or 3 sentences, that would be great.
Right. Well, I'm telling you, right, the state is divided in 3 parts. 2 of those parts are what we call the permanent government. It's the judiciary and about 400 senior servants that are ironically called the senior civil servants. But that's who the majority is, 2 parts. If we elect Jesus, he's only the other 1/3. So he's the majority, and he's not allowed to take his seat on the gravy train unless he signs a contract to that permanent government, not the people that elect him. So nobody's going to save you. If Jesus can't save you, nobody's going to save you. So we need a plan B.
Could I interchange Mahatma Gandhi? When you say Jesus, you're not trying to convert us. What you're saying is that a highly respected person would not even.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Just to clarify that.
Not even Jesus can save us.
Yeah. So okay. So first of all, guys, thanks for coming in. Just stay there in case there's something else to be said. Diarmuid, what do you think of deregistration?
Well, I would disagree with it respectfully. However, pretty much everything the lads have said, I would agree with. But what I might offer, which hopefully would help people, is I think we need to distinguish between what is democracy in itself and what are elections. Elections do not equate with democracy. They're only a form that we utilize. So there's a difference between form and content. There are many, the question being whether people rule or we don't rule. And I'm absolutely sure the Irish people do not rule Ireland. There's a very narrow segment of vested interests that rule, and they have their political party system doing their bidding and creating the illusion that there's a debate going on about policy in the state and so on, whereas there's nothing of the kind. But not to confuse this content of democracy or lack of it with whatever forms we might have for elections or referendums and so on. So the people, I think, should avail of every opportunity, voting or otherwise, to advance their own interests. But ultimately what we need in Ireland is, it's the same in every country, what we need is revolution, in fact. We need to change the fundamental basis of the society we live in from one where the people are ruled over by powerful vested interests to one where the people themselves actually exercise their power. And that is where the debate needs to be. What are the means that people can utilize to exercise our democracy? Because democracy exists 7 days a week, every week of the year, not once every 4 or 5 years when there is an election happens to come around. So earlier on there, Sinead did mention things which I've been advocating for years myself. That is the right to unelect or recall candidates or representatives when they no longer honour their mandate, or the idea of holding referendum either on a national or a local basis, even down to questions of planning projects. We see all these big schemes going into on board Planola that, like here we have in Ringaskiddy and Cork, an incinerator, and over 20 years the local community has taken cases and won them, yet these persist. So why cannot the local community here in Cork vote and say we do not want this here? We can't, because our democracy is hijacked, basically. I would abhor the idea of going back to the 1922 constitution of the Free State, which, don't forget, was imposed by counter-revolution and was a constitution which tied us to loyalty to the English crown and so on. But yes, in that document there were aspects of direct democracy which De Valera did drop when it came to drafting the 37 constitution, much to huge objections of the Irish people at the time, and they wanted to keep those provisions here. So we're a people who are ruled over. Our democracy does not exist. We have forms and pretense, but we have no content. The people are not empowered, and that's the issue of today, the issue of the empowerment of the Irish people.
Well, I think that everybody is on the same hymn sheet when it comes to what would be in the best interest of the country from a democratic point of view. We may not fully agree on the means to getting there, though I think the only real objection is the means in terms of deregistration process itself. But also, I think we would agree some form of constitutional change is needed. Sinead, Chris, Diarmuid, I'd like to really thank you for coming on the show tonight. We've gone over time again. I apologise for that.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Listen, Sinead, Finbar, Stephen.
We'll be talking to you guys again. Stay safe.
Yeah.
Diarmuid, if there's any activities coming up, I nod out, wink, wink. If you want to let us know about them, we'd be happy to report on them after the event.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
We'll just now talk about next week's program for a minute. Over the last season of programs, over the last, 8-9 weeks, we have featured independent Republican councillors from the north of Ireland, but we've also featured representatives from loyalist or unionist communities in the north of Ireland as well. And we've discussed issues of the challenges they face in representing their communities, but also we've discussed issues about how they define themselves culturally in terms of nationalist or unionist, etc. Next week, we have two of those representatives from their communities on, Councillor Gary Donnelly and Brian Doherty, to talk about the boundaries that they have and the flexibility of their boundaries in terms of concepts such as a united Ireland and in terms of concepts about working together much closer in the future. So, for instance, we do know that Councillor Donnelly put in an objection, put down a motion to not commemorate the 100 years of partition by Derry City Council, or Derry Council. That motion has caused some upset in unionist and loyalist communities. So we're going to talk about things like that, and we're going to ask Councillor Donnelly on the one hand, is there any flexibility with that unwillingness to commemorate unionist events? And on the other side, we're going to ask the unionist representatives in terms of how far you'd be willing to let the British establishment go in terms of tyranny or in terms of severe economic policies before you would consider either a sovereign Northern Ireland or joining a united Ireland of some sort. So it's going to be a very, very interesting discussion next week. I'm really looking forward to it. And guess what? I know these lads, and it's going to be done respectfully. And I think that's the most important thing. I'm really impressed by these guys over the past, how they work with each other and in their communities and how they present themselves. Far more impressed than representatives from the bigger parties in Northern Ireland. I'm looking forward to next week. Join us at Thursday at 9 o'clock. So that's Thursday, the 28th of January at 9 o'clock. Be safe until then. See you then.